The new Spider-Man game opens with Spider-Man getting a call from the police chief, and then rushing off to help arrest Wilson Fisk, the Kingpin. We see the Spider-Man costume, the newspaper clippings, and various things that tell us it's Spider-Man we're dealing with, but the first thing we see that tells us about Peter Parker as a character is a rent overdue letter that is slipped under the door. This is the first thing we know about Spider-Man. He's a hero with bills to pay. Section 1. Introduction.
The balancing act between school, work, family, friends, love life, and also being a superhero are essential to the character, and they always have been from the very beginning. As time passed, Peter Parker, as a kid from a single-parent family in a poorer area of Manhattan, evolved as the perfect extension of Spider-Man as the relatable underdog.
In this essay, I'm going to talk about Spider-Man. I love Spider-Man. I'm going to be talking about all different kinds of Spider-Man. Spider-Man comics, Spider-Man games, Spider-Man films. There's no real point trying to put one version of Spider-Man above another, since there is one that is objectively superior, and it's Toho Spider-Man. Yeah, wow.
I love it. Why is he fighting a giant? Is he a Power Ranger? Spider String. It's so good. It's so good. What? Look, he's a doll. Why does he have a motorbike? Spider-Man doesn't need a motorbike. What? Why does he have a car? What? Why does the car fly? Why does he have a car and missiles and a fucking... Why does he have a giant robot? I don't understand. Why is the robot called Leopardon? Like a leopard. He's Spider-Man. Why does he have a gun? Spider-Man doesn't use a gun. I love this show. I love this show so much. What? So I'm not talking about one Spider-Man or another Spider-Man. I'll use examples, but I'm talking about the core of the character, the essential Spider-Man. The Spinner Gattungswesen. I want to offer some things I think about the character. Why I think that it's one of the best characters ever written, really. Some things I just generally like because, guys, I really love Spider-Man, and I've got some things I want to say.
Spider-Man.
Section 2. The Modern Myth.
Superheroes are sometimes called the modern myths. Oh man, I'm feeling really spacey. I just gave blood like an hour ago or something. They said I have to keep this on for 6 hours. Okay. Superheroes are sometimes called the modern myths, and in a sense they are. They're characters that we know intimately well, that are born and reborn across infinite stories without strict canon. They teach us who to be and how to be.
We talk about these characters like they're real, just like the ancient Greeks did with their mythical characters. Incidentally, I think we should consider whether the ancient Greeks really thought mythical characters were real people. Sure, we have accounts where someone may say like, this reminds me when Orpheus couldn't look at Eurydice, but would it be all that weird for someone now to write, this reminds me when Captain America got hypnotized into thinking that the NYPD were neo-Nazis by Baron Zemo? It wouldn't mean that person thinks Captain America is a living, breathing human being. It means they and we see these characters as real in a different sense altogether. Anyway, comic book characters represent things in real life, be they human struggles, philosophical questions, or even political concepts. Jason Dittmer, author of Popular Culture, Geopolitics, and Identity, talked about being in geography class when he was younger and understanding it because of what he'd seen in episodes of Star Trek. So, I guess all you fuckers on Reddit who told me not to bring politics into Star Trek can just get in the sea, because I have a university professor on my side now. Dittmer has also talked about comic book characters and what they represent politically. For example, Captain America can be used as a handy metaphor for the writer to express what they think America is, or what they think America should be, or what it's currently doing wrong. The character was invented by two Jewish artists who wanted to convince America to get involved in World War II. After World War II was over and the Cold War began, Captain America quit punching Nazis and started punching filthy commies instead. Through the height of McCarthyism, Cap battled Soviet threat after Red Menace, but then, as the hysteria passed and America grew pretty rightfully embarrassed of the anti-communist witch hunt, Captain America became increasingly unpopular due to his association with McCarthyism. In an attempt to revive the character, Marvel rebooted the series and had Steve Rogers discovered frozen in a block of ice. They initially tried to retcon the previous decades of comic punching, but soon realizing that wouldn't do, they wrote that the Captain America who'd been running around in the interlude was an imposter. So there was a Captain America who was real, who was back now, and that Captain America from before, see, he was a fake. He wasn't the real Captain America.
Look, to paraphrase Innuendo Studios, comics aren't good because they're subtle.
Even recently, there was a storyline where the Red Skull rewrote history using a magical doohickey to make Captain America a secret member of Hydra. Hydra being an evil occult organization that, among other things, worked with the Nazis. There was a bit of controversy over this because of the outrageous move to reveal Captain America had always secretly been a Nazi. But the full story arc was that when Red Skull, a Nazi, rewrote history to make Cap a secret Hydra agent, there was Hydra Cap, who was evil, and there was actually a second Steve Rogers created from the memories of his friends. So there was Captain America, who turned out to be a secret super Nazi, and another good Captain America that was how his friends remembered him, and they all had to work together to make Captain America how they remembered from before. It's not good because it's subtle. The myth of Spider-Man is the story of a young person trying to live up to great expectations. The superpowers aren't the important bit, although in some ways the superhero Spider-Man fits the character so well, it's almost a metaphor. Anyone who's been a young adult trying to get by knows the feeling of swinging from place to place, never totally safe, simultaneously a little excited and totally terrified. Come on, Eric, just do one essay without referencing your crippling eternal brokenness. Spider-Man is the myth for people in a part of their life where the system isn't really working perfectly for them. That's why when I think of the comics, I always think of this one Christmas arc where he has to save New York, but he also has a cold and he wears a hat and scarf over his costume the whole time. It's why the common collective idea of Peter Parker either has a job with a Daily Bugle or delivering pizzas. Aspirationally, you're meant to be just like Peter Parker for a bit, and eventually you'll get so successful you'll be like Tony Stark, right? Since for some people though, not being accepted isn't just one phase of their lives, Spider-Man turns out to be a myth that teaches us empathy, and shows us how different groups of people are marginalized in similar ways. In fact, when Peter Parker grows up, in the comics he enters kind of a weird phase. Being successful and rich does not suit Spider-Man. There's a bit in a recent arc where Tony Stark hires Mary Jane Watson as his assistant, and Peter tries to hire Pepper Potts as a revenge? It doesn't work, and it's really embarrassing. X-Men is commonly pointed to as the Marvel comic about gay people. The Marvel comic about gay people. First premiering in the 60s and being used as an analogue for the civil rights movement, and then finding its footing as an LGBT analogue in the 80s during the height of the AIDS crisis. It featured a group of flamboyant young people who were different in a certain way that could naturally occur to anyone in a family, often made people hate them and force them to run away. There are certain diseases that only affect their group, and at any point in the canon, looking towards the future shows a world ravaged by war to exterminate them all. The threat of genocide against them is always hanging over them. I bring this up because X-Men is most obviously about gay people, but the way their system and world is created, the marginalized group they represent could kind of be anyone. And that's kind of great. That's kind of exactly why it works. In Spider-Verse, it's established early that Miles' dad, a cop, doesn't like Spider-Man because... yeah, that checks out. After Miles gets his powers and meets Spider-Man and comes home, he asks his dad, "Hey, Dad, you hate Spider-Man, right?" And his dad tells him, "You know how I feel about Spider-Man." The question hanging in the air, unsaid, is, "Dad, if I was Spider-Man, would you hate me?" I mean, it's not good because it's spectacular, and in this case, it is kind of subtle. Miles' dad's arc in Spider-Verse is complex, but a part of it has to do with this dislike of Spider-Man. During the final conflict, Miles is knocked down by Kingpin, and Miles' dad, who doesn't know he's Spider-Man, who we're sure hates Spider-Man, who we know for sure definitely hates Spider-Man, we know he doesn't like Spider-Man, definitely for certain, calls out to him and yells, "Get up, Spider-Man."
And then I cry a lot.
In the first pages of Amazing Spider-Man issue number 33, an iconic scene in Spider-Man canon, Spider-Man is trapped under heavy rubble and exhausted from fighting in a flooding room. It looks like there's no way out for him, but in what is apparently a narratively empty moment that has gone on to define so much about the character for years to come, Peter Parker just thinks of his family and his uncle's death, and he finds the strength to free himself. In a similar scene in Homecoming, Peter is trapped under rubble and can't lift it, and his cries for help remind you on this visceral level that he's just a child. Tom Holland's performance is honestly just astonishing. As this iteration of Spider-Man frees himself, he says to himself, "Come on, Peter. Come on, Spider-Man." So when Jeff yells out to Miles, "Get up, Spider-Man," it isn't just the culmination of an arc about a father accepting his son for being different in a way he can't admit, it's also the evolution of a theme and of a scene repeated across the iterations of the myth of Spider-Man. Spider-Verse repeatedly says in no uncertain terms that Spider-Man's greatest power is his ability to always get up again when he gets knocked down. This, as a defining trait of the character of Spider-Man, ties in with his emotional, interpersonal, and financial struggles. It's saying in more ways than one that the greatest power you can have is the ability to get up again, no matter how many times you're knocked down. Section 3. Validation and Validity. Okay guys, let's jump down there, do a fucking great jump, and then we're just gonna zip around, fight some crime. Ready? Let's do it! Yeah, shit, this is gonna be so good. Yeah. Woohoo! Yeah! Okay, let's go. Spider-Man. Dead of night, at the scene of the crime, at the theme of light, he arrives just in time.
Spider-Man is a poor young person just trying to survive. He's living multiple lives at once, he's lost people, and he feels uncertain about the future. He makes me feel valid.
You might not think of Spider-Man as a working class hero, but he is inarguably a working class hero. A hero who is working class. He also dresses in red and black and beats up rich guys, and his mantra is a rewording of no unjust hierarchies, so that's not for nothing. The game, Spider-Man 2018, is fantastic in so many ways. It's amazing. The only thing significantly holding it back is that there isn't already a bombastic Bagman costume. The game strikes that exact usual note that Spider-Man strikes that makes him so relatable. It shows Peter as someone struggling to spin too many plates at once. His relationship, his career, his apartment, his family, and of course, being Spider-Man. As a young person trying to sort out my own life, that makes me feel pretty valid. It also helps that there's a huge LGBT rainbow flag in the game you kind of can't conceivably miss unless you play it with your eyes closed. That makes me feel kind of valid too.
Valid. I'm so valid. Okay, what am I talking about? The colloquial use of the word valid, usually by the LGBT community, refers to a feeling of belonging, a sense that you're allowed. It's someone telling you, don't worry bud, it's okay, that's fine. Phil Stein made a fantastic video about his feelings around being called valid by people after he came out as non-binary. He talked about feeling defensive, as though people telling him you're valid somehow doubted the internal sense of validity he had tried really hard to build up. He talked about needing to build up those defensive feelings to protect that internal sense of validity.
Feeling valid is for everyone. It just makes sense that people who feel on the outside of society could kind of use it more often. It's nice when the system isn't built for you to be reminded that that's the case, and it's not you that's wrong. Donald Norman talks in The Design of Everyday Things about how when things are poorly designed, it can have a depressive effect. Create the impression in the user that they are stupid or bad, the reason for the failure. For LGBT folks or people of color, society is pretty poorly designed, so it can be really nice to be told, don't worry bud, it's all okay, you're valid. Like I say though, feeling valid is for everyone. Cishet white guys need validating for them that having feelings is okay and allowed, that they can have sexuality that's not inherently predatory, that they can have friendships that aren't competitions. Are we all feeling nice and valid? Great, let's carry on. There are other smaller ways the game makes me feel valid too. J. Jonah Jameson is recast as a conspiracy theory podcaster shouting at low information callers for liking Spider-Man or generally disagreeing with him, openly promoting wild conspiracy theories and of course merch. Are you guys seeing what I'm seeing? He's Alex Jones!
My loyal listeners, brushheads they call themselves, though I've never quite understood why, will remember my warnings about the downright Orwellian crime monitoring system the city was installing. Unbelievable. I understand we have another low information caller who thinks we're better off thanks to Spider-Man.
It's like prejudiced.
Wrong! Here's a little lesson in the English language, my friend. Prejudice means to prejudge someone before you know anything about them. I know all I need to about Spider-Man. Folks, I have to once again defend myself against the spurious claims from McDonald Mac Gargan, aka the Scorpion. Yes, as I fully disclosed, I bankrolled the experiment that gave him superior strength, speed, and that unsightly cyborg tail. The idea was to create an anti-Spider-Man who is not a threat and stops menaces. I had no idea he was crazy. Do you think his resume said psycho with a poisoning fetish? His lawsuit is a transparent attempt to reduce his sentence at the raft by placing the blame for his deeds on me.
On some level, silly as this is, that makes me feel valid too. Like I'm not just totally crazy. This makes me feel like grown-ass adults. The kind of grown-ass adults who can make a Spider-Man game, no less, see the same bizarre hell world we live in that I see. The game also presents fresh takes on characters I personally, even as a lifelong Spider-Man fan, found a bit stale or odd. Martin Lee, or Mr. Negative, in the comics is an illegal immigrant who snuck into America to be with his wife. Except, no, he's actually not. Those are stolen memories, and he's actually a human trafficker who killed the real Martin Lee and then snuck into America and became a millionaire.
Yikes.
His power is that he has a dark energy when in his evil persona, Mr. Negative, and he has a gang called the Demons who are these Chinese opera masks, or in some versions the gang is just a few close members of his inner circle, the Inner Demons. I never really had that much interest in reading stories with Mr. Negative in because his whole deal kind of stank from a mile away of oriental mysticism and kind of anti-immigrant nonsense. The new game takes a bit of a fresh perspective on Martin Lee though. For one thing, he isn't an immigrant and he is Martin Lee. For another, his powers are really tied to his trauma. His parents were killed in an experiment that also gave him the powers.
Lee's pain, his anger, it's fueling his power.
In the game, Peter Parker travels into the psyche of Martin Lee twice, and in there battles a giant spirit demon, and when he defeats it, Martin Lee is saved. See, when you defeat the demon on the inside, he stops being Mr. Negative. When you help him battle his inner demons, Look, it's not good because it's subtle. It's good because even when Spider-Man defeats his enemy, what he really does is save him. That sense of validity, being shown that you're okay, that you aren't the problem, is tied into how empathic the writing is.
Cool, guys, so let's play some Spider-Man. We're gonna fight some... Wait, what's that? Gamer Paradise? Let me in! Let me in! I wanna go to Gamer Paradise! Stupid fake building! Let me in! Just fucking let me in! I wanna go to Gamer Paradise!
Spider-Man Homecoming reframes the classic superhero narrative really interestingly, where we would expect a few tokenistic scenes to explain who the villain is and what they're up to. We get like tons of time explaining why Adrian Toomes does what he does. He's a working class dude and Stark made his business defunct, so he hates Stark. He wants to care for his family and his business, and as long as he's got his, he doesn't care what happens to everybody else. Peter Parker is a working class kid from a single parent family in a poor neighborhood. He's succeeding because he's like really smart, but his aunt has to work full time to make sure they do okay, so we know that pizza delivery job is a dead cert when he eventually gets into college. We have the classic superhero coming of age arcs, and the good guy fights the bad guy and the bad guy goes to jail. Or does he? Because after Toomes goes to jail, we explicitly see how devastated his family will be by this, and throughout the film, Tony Stark's wealth and the way he throws his power around are very explicitly harmful to poorer characters and communities. And honestly, is Iron Man the bad guy in this movie? Seriously, Tony Stark gives a teenager a death machine supersuit and wants to mold him to be exactly the way he thinks a hero should be, and the end of the movie is actually Peter refusing his offer of joining the Avengers. You could very reasonably argue Stark and his neoliberal or semi-neocon politics is the real villain of the piece, and Vulture is just a representative of the working class that's been turned against itself. The film was released in 2017. In 2016, a huge number of white working class people in America were behind Bernie Sanders, especially younger voters. When Hillary got the Democratic nomination, Trump surged ahead with white voters generally, and made a big show of appealing to the white working class. Although Trump's votes were actually spread evenly across classes, they were all just super white. I don't want to get too me about this, but there is literally a scene where Spider-Man and Vulture's fighting cuts the Staten Island ferry in half, and the ferry is called the Spirit of America. They divided the Spirit of America. The fighting tore apart the spirit of a... They were fighting and it... Do you get it? Because Marvel really hopes you get it. Like, it's not good because it's subtle. The framing of Peter Parker's relationship to Tony Stark is kind of fascinating. Stark is almost Peter's Jungian shadow. He's this successful, rich scientist bro who flies around saving the world, and canonically, Peter has idolized him almost his entire life. But also, Tony's a malformed person, an egotistical wreck who constantly makes things worse when he tries to help, and might just be doing things for others to serve his own ego. On the other hand, because of Stark's many personal problems, he wishes he could kind of go back in time to when he was more innocent and start over, maybe not make some of the same mistakes. As much as Peter wishes he was Tony, Tony wishes he was Peter. They're like Dr. Dre and Eminem, or Eminem and early Eminem. What makes this work even better is that besides being on the same side, Iron Man and Spider-Man are kind of opposites. Tony Stark is a middle-aged man in a literal metal shell who created a weapon out of self-defense. He flies around above everyone, and when he reaches out his hand, a fucking laser beam shoots out to destroy things. His mask even looks like a dude with a receding hairline, and when he's in the suit, he is literally seeing the world through a lens that he made for himself. Spider-Man is this kid who got powers and immediately decided it was wrong to not help people. He swings around, soaring through the air, but permanently tethered to the real world. His mask has these big, wide eyes, because ultimately what defines Peter Parker as a character is curiosity. His costume is just clothes, so he's kind of vulnerable, out in the open. And when he reaches out his hand, he fires webbing, either to stick someone down, to stop them from doing harm, or hold things together.
So there's this kind of fascinating balance, right? A struggle between validation and validity. On the one hand, you have this ultra-smart, buff, womanizing billionaire genius, the ultimate male power fantasy. And on the other hand, you have this kid from Queens who's just trying to get by. The relatable underdog. A hero with bills to pay.
Let me be clear, validation isn't bad. I'm not condemning the concept of validation. That would be wild. Who would ever do that? I'm just trying to distinguish between validating people who are already doing well, telling them the things they are aspiring to and think are cool and good and ignoring any downsides, and letting people know the natural human things they are doing, like existing, or being in love, or getting horny on main, or having feelings, are perfectly natural.
For the purposes of this essay, we're talking about validation. You're great and cool and neat and good, and nothing you ever do ever is bad. And validity. You aren't bad for just existing and having human needs.
If you're a cishet white guy, Tony Stark validates you as a cool cishet white dude, but Peter Parker teaches you to actually be a cool cishet white dude. Like someone who's empathetic and kind and neat and good. But Peter Parker as a cishet white dude isn't the point. Spider-Man as the outsider is. Miles Morales and Spider-Gwen are beloved characters, and I feel like on some level their creation was inevitable because ultimately Spider-Man is just a great underdog. But he also has some bills to pay. Stan Lee created an amazing character that tons of people find relatable and empowering, but at the end of the day, Peter Parker is still white, cis, male, and heterosexual. For now. I've seen trans women who are fans of Spider-Man call Peter Parker an obvious closeted trans woman. Although I'm not going to get into that debate right now, it speaks to how intensely relatable Spider-Man is and how well the character relates to being a marginalized member of society. I think because of that, it was only natural that the writers would want to create alternative versions of Spider-Man, alternate realities where Spider-Man is a woman or a black teenager. There are just certain perspectives Peter Parker can't explore. Spider-Man is a character you should expect to get rewritten and reimagined, and whose secret identity should change, because the identity of the person under the mask has everything to do with who the character is. Section 4. Eight-Legged Freaks. All the best Spider-Man villains are in some ways reflections of Spider-Man. The Vulture is a working-class guy taking on the rich and powerful. Sandman just cares about his family. Venom started out as a metaphor for drug dependency, a common problem people in Peter Parker's situation encounter. Venom is almost literally Spider-Man's shadow, and when Peter Parker finally kicks his use of Venom... Look, comics aren't good because they're subtle. When Peter Parker finally gets clean, Eddie Brock, Peter's rival, takes Venom on and is consumed by it. Even less famous antagonists have something to offer, like Tombstone, the indestructible gangster. Tombstone is an albino African American, and he was bullied as a kid for being different, which made him rely on being tough. Peter Parker is a working class kid, but as a sciencey little nerd, he's also an outsider within his own marginalized community. Not all the Spider-Man villains reflect something about Spider-Man though. There's also like Hammerhead. He just hits things with his head? He's just got like a really hard head? Like, what? Who created this character?
There are also the clones, which they don't exactly say anything about Spider-Man, they just are Spider-Man. Man, the Clone Saga is really a wasted opportunity. Nonetheless, maybe it says something about the character relationships in Spider-Man, as though the subtext is rising to the level of the text.
Perhaps no villain reflects Peter Parker quite as much, though, as Dr. Otto Octavius. Otto is an older, in some ways, embittered scientist, and in most versions of his story, he's suffering from a neurodegenerative illness. He's brilliant and talented and nerdy, and he wants to help people. Crucially, and different from Iron Man, he's a bullied and downtrodden character. It's a similarity with Peter that Tony doesn't have. Then, though, because of his sickness, because of his bitterness, and because of neural interface experiments that damage parts of his brain that blah blah blah, Otto decides he's had enough, and the rest of the world can go screw. He's only going to look out for number one from now on. He's everything young Peter Parker wants to be, and at the same time, so wrong. Ultimately, Spider-Man knows he could have become Dr. Octavius. He's Peter's perfect parallel.
There's even the character names. Stan Lee compulsively named things with alliterative first and last names. And what's next to P for Peter Parker in the alphabet? That's right, O for This bit's too far, isn't it? I'm starting to tell when I'm going too far. Yeah.
For real though, no villain reflects Spider-Man as well as Doc Ock. It's no accident that Dr. Octopus, modeled after an 8-limbed creature, is the nemesis of Spider-Man. When Dr. Octavius first appears with the robotic arms, or if you'd rather, when Dr. Octopus first appears, he says,
"For the first time in my life, I don't feel like a failure. I feel like me."
In some sense, Otto's sickness is metaphorical. The real sickness isn't the one in his body, it's the one in his soul. Superheroes are sometimes called the modern myths. In a sense, they are. They're characters we know intimately well that are born and reborn across infinite stories without strict canon. They are there to teach us who to be and how to be. Otto Octavius is using a prosthesis that makes him more powerful. He's always imagined himself like this, so he sees this as his true self. And his whole life Feeling beaten down and denied what he's entitled to makes him want to use this new power to rule over others and get what he wants for himself. The scene between Peter and Otto after Otto is defeated is fantastically written. The dialogue taking the form only a conversation between two people who know each other really well can. They talk totally past each other, understanding each other too well and responding to what the other means, not to what they say.
I should have known you'd turn on me, just like all the others.
Turn. I've worshipped you. Your mind, your conscience, wanting to help others. The way you never gave up.
That's because men like us have a duty, a responsibility, to use our talents in the service of others. Even if they don't appreciate it, we have to do what's best for those beneath us, whether they understand it or not.
No, you're wrong!
Peter isn't saying they shouldn't help people, he's saying that the people without powers aren't beneath them. This is fundamental to the ideological difference between them. Otto sees people who aren't as smart as him as dependents, negotiating how much of his worth they get to share. And since they're beneath him, his actions don't have to be accountable to them. But Peter sees every human being as equal. Otto got his arms and saw it as an elevation above everyone else. Peter got his powers and saw it as only fair to use them to help everyone.
At its core, Insomniac Games' adventure strives to make you feel like Spider-Man.
38 seconds, IGN. You made it 38 seconds without saying it makes you feel like Spider-Man. Except in the written review, where it's literally the first sentence.
I wanted Marvel's Spider-Man on PS4 to make me feel like Spider-Man.
He did it twice! He did it!
Coupled with gameplay that made me feel like Spider-Man nearly every step of the way. Spider-Man's...
What?
It seems like the biggest compliment you can pay the new Spider-Man game on PlayStation 4 is that it makes you feel like Spider-Man.
And you really just feel like Spider-Man. That's the most important thing to note about this game.
Thanks to my boy Video Game Donkey, it's become a bit of a meme that the game makes you feel like Spider-Man. It's not just because of Donkey, it's because of the industry game reviewers. And it's also not just because of them. The game's official tagline is actually, be greater. When we talk about you're great and cool and nothing you ever do is bad, yeah, the marketing and reviews for this game are pretty bad. The game pretty clearly tries to tell you to learn from the character and be greater by, you know, being nice to people, doing what's right, helping. The marketing and reviews, on the other hand, lean pretty hard into how important it is to feel like Spider-Man. We draw validation from playing as a powerful character in a game, even more so when the player character is an established persona, a known quantity, a myth. A game is inherently a challenge to be beaten, and beating it is rewarding. So when you're someone who feels like they should be special, like they should be better than everyone else, playing as this character can mean a lot to you. You're using a prosthesis that elevates you above other people.
For the first time in my life, I don't feel like a failure. I feel like me.
So there's this expectation of who the player is and what they'll want. And the expectation is that they'll want validation, not validity. The person looking at the screen isn't learning from the person on the screen. They're just imagining themselves as them. I'm just like him. It was good, wasn't it? It was a good bit. It was very meta.
In the game, there are several sections where you play as Miles Morales, currently not superpowered, and Mary Jane Watson.
All I'm trying to say is, if you didn't like the missions with Miles and MJ, you're wrong, and you've missed the point of the game, and actually Spider-Man in general, and you're going to be banned from talking about comic books or games for life, for thought crime!
Okay, fine, how about this? All I'm trying to say is that we take validation from things like Spider-Man, when really it's trying to give us validity. Section 5. Conclusion. Tony Stark is Peter's shadow, his dark reflection, a bad possible version of what he could become. Otto Octavius is the same, a dark reflection of Peter Parker. At the same time, though, Tony and Otto reflect each other too. In the Invincible Iron Man story, Unfixable, Doc Ock holds New York hostage with a nuke and makes Tony grovel and beg and do a bunch of pretty kinky stuff. The story is interspersed with flashbacks developing Otto and Tony's history. The two of them have been long-standing rivals in the scientific community, even before their superhero shenanigans. Otto again and again told him, "Cheat to win, Stark." Octavius is so certain of his entitlement to success and victory that his philosophy is just cheat to win. At the end of the story, he reveals there was no nuke, he was just trying to manipulate Tony into groveling to him. I'm not saying Tony Stark isn't entitled, he was born a millionaire, but the story frames the dynamic as the two brilliant scientists, one who wants to work to achieve things, and the other who feels that he just deserves everything right away. Tony Stark is still being the typical power fantasy character just trying to be amazing and brilliant, but here he's brought low by Otto's bitterness and need for vengeance against a world that hasn't given him everything he thinks he deserves. Parker and Stark and Octavius are all reflections of one another. They're like three sides of the same... Anyway, they're all different takes on the same core character to some degree, right?
Spider-Man isn't there for you to imagine being. He's there to teach you how to be kind and good and happy. With great power comes great responsibility. He's not there to validate you as a white straight dude. He's there to make you feel valid as a black person, a woman, somebody who's just got loads to keep on top of, someone who's struggling, someone society doesn't see as normal, someone society misunderstands and misrepresents.
He is our modern myth, and just as with the myths of old, comparing yourself with the mythical figure is a big step in the wrong direction. When Caligula, when Alexander the Great, when Nero compared himself to gods instead of acting in a godly fashion, people started to recognize something was amiss. Myths are, in lieu of a detailed understanding of history, our cultural blueprints.
In a time when fascists are marching across the globe again, and America has a president who can be baited to the precipice of a nuclear war with a tweet, and scientists give us a decade to get our shit together or just boil to death on this stupid marble, the kind of myths we need are the ones that teach us that we can all be a hero. That the greatest things about us are the things that make us different. That the best power you can have is the ability to get up again no matter how many times you're knocked down.
Enormous thanks to Baphometrics, who produced amazing new music specially for this essay, and Ham the Man, who continues to make incredible tracks for this channel all the time. Thank you to you, the viewer, for watching all the way to the end, and to my patrons who make this all possible. If you want to support the channel, you can tip me at paypal.me/buycuriobiscuits, or subscribe on Patreon to give monthly. Welcome everyone to Curio Volume 2. I hope everyone had a good holiday period, and I, for one, am really looking forward to what's coming up this year. Well, until then, see you next time.
Do you remember why we broke up?
This is a trick question, isn't it?
Saved by the siren.
Talk to you later.
Go.
Love seeing you two together again. You always were my favorites.
Oh, I could have used my Spider-Man costume.